The story begins not in darkness, but under the bright, welcoming sun of the Algarve region in southern Portugal. It was late April in the year 2007. This area, known for its golden cliffs and safe waters, was a magnet for tourists seeking a quiet escape from the bustle of the United Kingdom. Among the thousands arriving that spring was a family of 5, 2 doctors and their 3 young family members. They checked into the Ocean Club in the village of Praia da Luz, a resort that promised tranquility and security. To the outside observer, the setting was idyllic. The Ocean Club was a sprawling complex of whitewashed apartments and swimming pools, designed to cater to middle-class families. The family was staying in an apartment located on the ground floor, positioned at the corner of the building. This specific location is crucial to understanding the events that followed. It was accessible, perhaps too accessible, sitting adjacent to a public street. From a security standpoint, a ground floor unit in a busy tourist area presents unique vulnerabilities that are often overlooked by vacationers, relaxed by the holiday atmosphere. On the evening of May 3, 2007, the atmosphere was calm. The weather was mild, typical for a Portuguese spring. The 2 doctors, along with a group of friends who would later become known in the media as the Tapas 7, decided to dine at the resort's tapas restaurant. The restaurant was located approximately 160 feet away from the apartment where the young family members were sleeping. Here, we must pause to analyze the psychology of this decision. In the world of travel safety, there is a concept known as the vacation mindset. When individuals enter a resort environment, their perception of risk often diminishes. The manicured gardens and the presence of other families create a psychological bubble of safety. One might ask, would these highly educated professionals have left their sleeping young family members unattended in an unlocked apartment in their home city? It is unlikely. Yet, in Praia da Luz, the distance of 160 feet felt insignificant. It was close enough to check on them, but far enough to create a window of opportunity for a tragedy to occur. Your engagement helps us shine a light where the shadows are deepest. By liking and subscribing, you ensure these forgotten files are reopened and the voiceless are finally heard. Stay with us, because the oversight we are about to reveal is harder to believe than the crime itself. The layout of the resort played a significant role. The tapas bar allowed the parents to have a clear view of the complex, but crucially, they did not have a direct line of sight to the specific door of their apartment. This architectural detail is a cornerstone of the investigation. It meant that anyone watching the apartment from the shadows could see when the parents were dining, but the parents could not see if someone was approaching the sleeping quarters. Critics and investigators have long debated the security measures taken that night. The patio door at the rear of the apartment was left unlocked to allow the parents to enter and exit for their checks without making noise. In hindsight, this decision has been scrutinized heavily. However, it is essential to view this through the lens of the parents at that moment. They believed they were in a safe, family-oriented environment. They established a checking roster, intending to return to the room at regular intervals. They believed this system was sufficient. They were wrong. It highlights a critical lesson in personal security. Negligence is often not a conscious act of harm, but a momentary lapse in judgment induced by a false sense of security. The doctors were intelligent, successful people, yet they made a decision that evening that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. As the sun set on May 3rd, the Ocean Club transformed from a holiday paradise into the setting of a profound and enduring silence. The timeline of May 3rd, 2007, is perhaps the most analyzed sequence of events in modern criminal history. Every minute has been dissected by police, journalists, and armchair detectives. To understand how the young subject disappeared, we must look at the specific movements of the adults that evening. The group arrived at the tapas restaurant around 8:30 in the evening. The arrangement was that one member of the group would leave the table roughly every 20 to 30 minutes to check on the sleeping family members in their respective apartments. This system relies on the assumption that nothing catastrophic can happen within a 20-minute window. However, Criminal psychologists suggest that an opportunistic offender needs far less time than that to execute a plan. At approximately 9:05 in the evening, the father of the missing subject left the table to conduct his check. He entered the apartment using the unlocked rear patio door. He observed that all three young individuals were asleep. The situation appeared normal. However, he noticed one detail that would later become significant. The door to the bedroom was open wider than he remembered leaving it. At the time, he dismissed it, perhaps attributing it to a draft. He returned to the restaurant, unaware that this might have been the moment the timeline began to fracture. Between 9:05 and 10 o'clock, other members of the Tapas 7 conducted their own checks. One friend offered to check on the doctor's apartment but only listened at the door rather than entering the room. This is a critical gap in the timeline. For nearly an hour, no one physically laid eyes on the young family member inside the room. This period is what investigators often refer to as the black hole of the timeline, the duration in which the incident most likely occurred. At 10 o'clock in the evening, the mother left the restaurant to make her check. She entered through the patio doors. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. As she moved toward the bedroom, she realized the door was open. A gust of wind slammed the door shut, revealing that the window and the external shutters were open. This was the moment the reality of the situation struck. The bed where her young subject had been sleeping was empty. The immediate reaction was one of confusion, quickly spiraling into panic. She searched the small apartment, hoping the little one had simply wandered off to the bathroom or the parents' bed, but the silence remained unbroken. She ran back to the restaurant, delivering the news that would ignite a global media storm. From an investigative perspective, the timeline reveals a terrifying precision. If the father's check at 9:05 was accurate, and the mother's discovery at 10 o'clock was definitive, the window for the taking was less than 60 minutes. However, if we consider that the friend did not enter the room at 9:30, the window expands. This timeline also introduces the concept of the opportunistic predator versus the planned attack. Did someone watch the pattern of the checks? Did they know that the group was dining just out of sight? The regularity of the checks might have ironically helped an observer time their move. The precision required to enter, locate the subject, and exit without being seen suggests either incredible luck or careful observation. Furthermore, we must address the Smith sighting. Shortly after 10 o'clock, a family walking nearby reported seeing a man carrying a young sleeping individual toward the beach. For years, this sighting was a primary lead. However, conflicting reports and changes in timelines have muddied the water. Was this the offender escaping into the night? Or was it just another tourist carrying their sleeping family member home? The tragedy of this timeline is its banality. It was a dinner like any other, a routine check like any other, until it wasn't. The shift from a mundane evening to a high-stakes investigation happened in a heartbeat. The failure to secure the crime scene immediately after the discovery meant that the timeline is the only solid evidence that remains. It tells us when, but it refuses to tell us who or how. The vanishing of the young subject left a void not just in the apartment, but in the very logic of how we understand safety and surveillance in a modern world. The hours immediately following the discovery of the open window and the empty bed are often referred to in criminal investigations as the golden hours. This period is critical because evidence is fresh, memories are sharp, and the perpetrator is likely still within a reachable distance. However, in the case of the vanishing at the Ocean Club, these golden hours turned into a chaotic sequence of missed opportunities and procedural errors that would compromise the investigation for decades. When the local law enforcement first arrived at the scene, the magnitude of the situation was not immediately apparent. The initial assumption by some officers was that the young individual had simply wandered off and would be found sleeping in a nearby garden or by the pool. This optimistic bias delayed the activation of a full-scale criminal protocol. Instead of immediately sealing off the apartment as a potential crime scene, the area remained accessible. Friends of the family, resort staff, and police officers moved in and out of the apartment. inadvertently contaminating the environment. From a forensic standpoint, this was a catastrophic failure. Every person who entered the room brought with them microscopic fibers, hair, and DNA, while potentially destroying the fragile traces left by an intruder. If an offender had touched a door handle, a window shutter, or the bedsheets, those fingerprints were at risk of being overlaid by the prints of the panicked search party. Reports suggest that by the time specialized crime scene investigators arrived, the integrity of the scene had been severely compromised. Furthermore, the coordination between local police and border control faced significant delays. In a case involving the taking of a person, immediate roadblocks and port closures are standard procedure to prevent the offender from leaving the jurisdiction. However, in the confusion of that night, these measures were not implemented with the necessary speed. The border between Portugal and Spain is porous and easily crossed, offering a quick escape route for anyone wishing to flee the Algarve region. The language barrier also played a detrimental role. The parents and their friends spoke English, while the initial responding officers spoke Portuguese. In high-stress situations, nuances are lost in translation. Descriptions of the timeline, the layout of the room, and the status of the doors were difficult to communicate accurately in those frantic first moments. This lack of clear communication likely contributed to the initial theory that this was a wandering-off event rather than a criminal act. Critics of the investigation point to this specific window of time as the moment the case was essentially lost. The absence of a secured perimeter meant that any physical evidence that could have linked a suspect to the apartment was likely destroyed or rendered inadmissible. It serves as a stark reminder of the importance of adhering to strict forensic protocols. Even when emotions run high, and the prevailing hope is that the incident is merely a misunderstanding, as the sun rose over Praia da Luz the following morning, the reality of the tragedy began to settle in, bringing with it a media presence of unprecedented scale. The disappearance of a young subject from a holiday resort struck a nerve globally. It tapped into a universal fear shared by parents everywhere, the violation of safety in a place of leisure. Within days, the resort was besieged by journalists, satellite trucks, and reporters from every major news network in the world. This intense media scrutiny acted as a double-edged sword. On one hand, it kept the face of the missing individual in the public eye, generating thousands of leads and sightings from across the globe. On the other hand, it placed immense pressure on the local authorities to produce results. In criminal investigations, pressure often leads to tunnel vision. The police needed a suspect, and the narrative began to shift rapidly. Initially, the investigation focused on the theory of a stranger, a criminal who had been watching the family. The description of a man seen carrying a bundle near the apartment circulated widely. However, as weeks turned into months without a breakthrough or a body, the atmosphere turned toxic. The public sympathy for the parents began to curdle into suspicion. This is a common psychological phenomenon in high-profile cases. When a monster cannot be found, the public often turns its gaze toward the survivors. The media began to scrutinize the behavior of the parents. Their lack of visible, hysterical emotion in certain interviews was misinterpreted by body language experts and tabloids as a sign of guilt. This armchair psychology ignored the fact that trauma manifests differently in every individual. Some collapse, while others enter a state of frozen shock or focused determination. The parents, being medical professionals, perhaps reverted to a clinical, compartmentalized mode of coping, which the public misread as coldness. The situation reached its nadir when the authorities formally named the parents as arguidos, or formal suspects. This legal status allowed the police to ask more aggressive questions, but to the public, it sounded like an accusation. The theory proposed by the police at this stage was that the young individual had perished in an accident in the apartment, and the parents had conspired to hide the tragic loss. This theory, however, lacked concrete physical evidence. It relied heavily on interpretation and the controversial indications of cadaver dogs, which are not admissible as definitive proof in a court of law. Eventually, the status of suspect was lifted and the parents were cleared of involvement. Yet, the damage was done. The media storm had muddied the waters, creating a polarized public opinion that distracted from the search for a real perpetrator. The focus on the family wasted valuable resources and time, allowing the true timeline of events to grow cold. It remains a powerful case study on how media narratives can hijack a criminal inquiry, forcing investigators to chase shadows cast by public opinion rather than following the evidence. For years, the investigation seemed to hit a dead end, with files gathering dust and leads drying up. However, in the background, a different narrative was slowly being pieced together, one that pointed away from the family and toward a ghostly figure who had been living in the margins of Algarve society. This figure would eventually be identified by German investigators as Christian B. Christian B. was a German national who had moved to Portugal in the mid-90s. To the casual observer, he was a drifter, a man who took on odd jobs in restaurants and offered mechanical services. He lived a transient lifestyle, moving between a dilapidated farmhouse and a Volkswagen camper van. His presence in the area was consistent, yet he managed to stay below the radar of the affluent tourist community. He was part of the invisible workforce that keeps a resort town running, but he harbored a dark history. Retrospective analysis of his background revealed a pattern of behavior that aligned disturbingly well with the profile of an opportunistic offender. Christian B. had a record of burglaries, specifically targeting holiday apartments and hotels. He knew that tourists often left cash and electronics in their rooms, and he knew that security in these relaxed environments was often lax. The Ocean Club was well within his territory. What makes Christian B. a compelling suspect is his proximity. Records indicate he was living just a few miles from the resort at the time of the incident. Furthermore, his lifestyle allowed him to move freely. He was not tethered to a 9-to-5 job that would account for his whereabouts. He existed in the shadows, driving his distinctive camper van along the coastal roads, a vehicle that could easily conceal a person or evidence. The breakthrough in connecting him to the case did not come from physical evidence found at the scene, but from a revisiting of his past. It was discovered that he had a history of crimes involving young individuals, a detail that immediately elevated him from a simple burglar to a potential serious offender. This history included a conviction for an attack on an elderly woman in the same region in 2005, a crime that demonstrated his willingness to enter occupied homes and his capacity for violence. The introduction of Christian B. into the narrative fundamentally shifted the understanding of the case. It moved the theory away from a domestic accident or a complex international trafficking ring and grounded it in a more terrifying reality. A local criminal with a history of entering homes who happened to be in the right place at the right time. The question that haunts investigators is whether his presence at the Ocean Club that night was a calculated act or a burglary that escalated into a tragedy when he discovered the apartment was not empty. It underscores the danger of overlooked individuals, those who live on the periphery of our vision, but whose actions can shatter lives. Christian B. was not a mastermind. He was a drifter with a dangerous past, and for years, he hid in plain sight while the world looked in the wrong direction. To understand the gravity of the suspicion against Christian B., one must look beyond the singular event of May 3rd, 2007. A criminal profile is rarely built on an anomaly. Rather, it is constructed from a history of escalating behaviors. When German investigators began to peel back the layers of Christian B.'s life in the Algarve, they did not find a harmless drifter. They found a pattern of predatory opportunism that had been refining itself for years. Christian B. made his living, in large part, through theft. But this was not merely shoplifting or petty larceny. His method of operation, known in law enforcement as his M.O., was specifically targeted at holiday accommodations. He understood the rhythm of a resort town. He knew that tourists, relaxed by the sun and wine, often became complacent with their security. They left windows unlatched to let in the sea breeze. They left patio doors unlocked while they dined nearby. For a burglar, these were not just oversights. They were invitations. Reports indicate that Christian B. was prolific in raiding hotel rooms and holiday apartments across the region. His primary goal was usually material gain: cash, cameras, passports, and jewelry. However, criminal psychologists often note that the leap from burglary to crimes against a person is smaller than the public imagines. A burglar who enters an occupied dwelling, known as a hot prowl, already possesses a dangerous lack of boundaries. They derive a thrill from the violation of a private space, while the occupants are present. The risk of confrontation is high, and for some offenders, that risk is part of the appeal. The most disturbing piece of this puzzle dates back to 2005, 2 years before the disappearance at the Ocean Club. In a villa not far from Praia da Luz, an elderly woman was subjected to a brutal attack. The intruder entered her home, subdued her, and subjected her to a severe violation. For years, this crime went unsolved. It was only later, through DNA evidence, that authorities linked this heinous act to Christian B. This revelation is critical for 2 reasons. First, it establishes that Christian B. was capable of extreme physical violence. He was not just a thief who would flee at the first sign of trouble. He was an individual who could dominate and harm a victim within their own sanctuary. Second, it proved he was operating in the exact geographic area with a feeling of impunity. He committed a major crime in 2005 and continued to live in the region, driving his van and working odd jobs, completely undetected by the local police force. When we analyze his profile, we see a dangerous escalation. The transition from property crime to violent attacks against vulnerable individuals suggests a deterioration of moral restraint. If the theory holds that he entered the Ocean Club apartment initially to steal, the presence of a young subject might have triggered a darker impulse, one that he had already acted upon with the previous victim 2 years prior. The tragedy here lies in the disconnect between these crimes. Had the 2005 case been solved immediately, Christian B. would have been incarcerated in 2007. He would not have been in his van, parked near the ocean, roaming the streets of Praia da Luz. This failure of the justice system to connect the dots in real time allowed a dangerous individual to remain in the ecosystem of the resort, waiting for his next opportunity. It forces us to ask, how many other signals were missed? How many other smaller crimes paved the way for the ultimate tragedy? In the absence of physical DNA evidence at the scene, modern investigations often turn to what is known as digital DNA. In the early 2000s, cell phone technology was widespread, but the forensic tracking of devices was not as sophisticated or as immediate as it is today. However, the data recorded by cell towers is stubborn. It remains archived, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. Years after the investigation had gone cold, this digital archive provided the most compelling link between Christian B. and the vanishing of the young subject. Investigators managed to retrieve cell tower records from Praia da Luz for the night of May 3, 2007. This task was monumental, involving the sifting of thousands of data points from a busy tourist hub. Among the noise of holiday calls and text messages, they found a specific handshake, a connection between a mobile device and the cell tower nearest to the Ocean Club. That device belonged to Christian B. The data is chilling in its precision. It places his phone in the immediate vicinity of the apartments, between 9 o'clock and 10 o'clock in the evening. This time frame aligns perfectly with the black hole in the timeline, the hour when the checks by the parents and their friends left the young subject unobserved. While being near a resort is not a crime, especially for a local resident, the timing is too coincidental to be easily dismissed. But the evidence goes deeper. The records show that at 7:32 in the evening, just as the sun was setting and families were preparing for dinner, Christian B. received a phone call. This was not a fleeting interaction. The conversation lasted for 30 minutes. In the world of criminal analysis, a 30-minute phone call is significant. It implies a transfer of information, a detailed discussion, or perhaps a negotiation. The identity of the person on the other end of that line remains one of the case's most enduring mysteries. The number was unlisted, likely a prepaid burner phone, common among those involved in illicit activities like drug dealing or theft. Police have appealed publicly for this caller to come forward, stating that they are a key witness. This person knows exactly where Christian B. was standing, what his mood was, and perhaps what his intentions were just 1 hour before the tragedy unfolded. There are several theories regarding this call. Was it a signal? Did an accomplice watch the apartment and alert Christian B. that the parents had left for the restaurant? Or was it a mundane conversation unrelated to the crime, which simply places the suspect at the scene by bad luck? Skeptics argue that cell tower data is not GPS. It puts him in the area, but not necessarily in the room. However, for a man with his specific history to be loitering outside a family resort during the exact window of a high-profile disappearance is a statistical anomaly that demands an explanation. This digital footprint serves as a ghostly anchor in the case. It is a silent witness that cannot be intimidated or forgetful. It proves that while the physical search for the young subject was taking place in the chaotic streets, the electronic signals were already telling a story that police would not read for another decade. It highlights a painful truth about cold cases. Sometimes the evidence is not lost. It is simply buried in data that we have not yet learned how to process. The 30-minute call stands as a locked door in the investigation, and finding the key, the identity of the unknown caller, could be the final piece needed to solve the puzzle of what happened that night. In the intricate puzzle of the investigation, physical evidence is often scarce. However, in the case focusing on the suspect known as Christian B., two specific mechanical elements stand out not just as modes of transport, but as potential silent accomplices to the events of May 3, 2007. These are the vehicles that the suspect owned and operated during his time in the Algarve. A distinctive camper van and a luxury sedan. To investigators and criminal profilers, the movements and management of these vehicles offer a window into the suspect's mindset and, crucially, his timeline. The first vehicle of significant interest is a Volkswagen T3 Westphalia camper van. This was not merely a car, it was a residence. Christian B. lived a transient lifestyle, often dwelling within this van to avoid the costs of renting a permanent home, and, perhaps more importantly, to maintain a level of anonymity and mobility. The van was painted in a two-tone scheme, white on the upper half and yellow on the lower half, making it recognizable to locals. From an investigative standpoint, a camper van changes the logistical calculus of a disappearance. Unlike a standard sedan, a van offers a secure, enclosed space that is shielded from public view. It allows an individual to transport large items or people without drawing immediate attention. It also provides a mobile environment where biological traces can be contained. For a suspect who drifts between locations, the van serves as a base of operations that can disappear overnight. Witnesses reported seeing similar vans parked in the vicinity of the Ocean Club in the days leading up to the incident, watching the resort. While van life is common in the surfing culture of Portugal, the presence of this specific vehicle near the scene has become a focal point for German prosecutors. However, it is the second vehicle, a Jaguar XJR-6, that provides the most chilling circumstantial evidence regarding the suspect's behavior immediately following the tragedy. This dark-colored luxury car, with German license plates, was also in Christian B.'s possession. It was a vehicle that stood out, perhaps inconsistent with the profile of a man living in a camper van and surviving on odd jobs and burglaries. The critical detail regarding the Jaguar is not its make or model, but the administrative action taken regarding its ownership. Records discovered by investigators show that on May 4, 2007, the very day after the young individual vanished, Christian B. contacted the vehicle licensing authorities in Germany. He did not call to renew his registration or pay a fine. Instead, he urgently requested that the vehicle be re-registered under the name of an acquaintance. We must pause here to evaluate the weight of this action. In the world of criminal psychology, the sudden disposal or transfer of assets immediately following a high-profile crime is often interpreted as distancing behavior. Why would a person feel the compelling need to remove their name from a vehicle less than 24 hours after a major police mobilization in their town? Critics and analysts argue that this action suggests panic. If the Jaguar had been used in the commission of the act, perhaps to transport the individual from the immediate area of the Ocean Club to a secondary location, the suspect would be terrified of it being identified. The license plates would be a liability. By transferring the registration, the suspect creates a layer of bureaucratic separation between himself and the machine. It is a move calculated to confuse a paper trail. Furthermore, the timing is too precise to be dismissed as a coincidence. The investigation into the disappearance was headline news by the morning of May 4th. Roadblocks were eventually being discussed, and descriptions of suspicious vehicles were being solicited by the police. In this context, the administrative transfer of the Jaguar looks less like a mundane chore and more like a tactical retreat. The acquaintance to whom the car was registered later told police that they had not even purchased the car, implying that Christian B. used their identity to offload the liability of the vehicle. This adds another layer of deception to the narrative. It paints a picture of a man who was scrambling to clean up his footprint, to sever ties with the physical objects that could link him to the events of the previous night. These vehicles also highlight the failure of the early investigation to look at the transient population. The police were focused on the family and the immediate resort staff. They were looking for a person on foot or a local resident. They missed the significance of the man in the van, the individual who had the means to watch, the vehicle to act, and the mobility to vanish. The camper van and the Jaguar remain central to the prosecution's theory. They represent the how in a case that has been plagued by the who and why. The van offered the privacy to commit the act or transport the individual, and the Jaguar represented the loose end that needed to be cut. Together, they form a mechanical trail of evidence that contradicts the suspect's silence. While the van has been seized and analyzed for biological traces, results of which remain largely confidential, the bureaucratic footprint of the Jaguar transfer stands as a matter of public record, a red flag waving in the timeline of May 4th that went unnoticed for over a decade. In the end, these machines are more than just metal and rubber. They are the vessels of the tragedy. They allowed a shadow to move through the sunny streets of Praia da Luz, and they facilitated the escape that has left a family waiting for answers for nearly 20 years. The re-registration is a signature of guilt, a desperate attempt to rewrite history before the ink was even dry on the police reports. By the year 2013, the investigation into the disappearance at the Ocean Club had largely stalled. The public fervor had cooled. The posters were fading, and the world had begun to accept the grim possibility that the mystery might never be solved. The police files were vast, filled with thousands of leads that had gone nowhere. However, while the official channels were silent, a conversation was taking place in a bar in Germany that would eventually shatter the deadlock. The setting was mundane, a local pub where Christian B. and an acquaintance were spending the evening. It was the 10th anniversary of the disappearance, and the television in the establishment was broadcasting a special report on the case. The face of the missing individual was on the screen, a reminder of the failure of justice. For most people, this image evoked sadness or sympathy. But for Christian B., it seemingly provoked a different reaction, a reaction driven by arrogance and the loosening effects of alcohol. According to the witness who would later come forward, the conversation shifted to the broadcast. The acquaintance commented on the baffling nature of the case, expressing a sentiment shared by millions. How could a young individual vanish without a trace in such a short window of time? It was at this moment that Christian B. allegedly dropped his guard. Driven perhaps by a narcissistic need to demonstrate superiority over the authorities, or simply the reckless urge to unburden a dark secret, he made a comment that implied he knew exactly what had happened. The specific phrasing of this alleged confession has been reported in various forms, but the core sentiment was chilling in its finality. He did not express speculation. He expressed knowledge. He reportedly indicated that the young subject did not scream, or that the situation resolved itself quickly. This was not the talk of an armchair detective discussing theories. It was the speech of someone who had been present. In the world of criminal psychology, this is known as leakage. Offenders, particularly those with psychopathic traits, often struggle to keep their achievements completely hidden. They derive a perverse sense of power from knowing what the rest of the world does not, and occasionally, that need for recognition overrides their instinct for self-preservation. The witness, however, did not run to the police station the next morning. This delay is a crucial aspect of the case that frustrates the public, but is well understood by criminologists. The circle in which Christian B. moved was not one of upstanding citizens. It was a world of petty criminals, drug dealers, and drifters. In this subculture, there is a strong code of silence. Going to the police is viewed as a betrayal, regardless of the severity of the crime discussed. Furthermore, the witness likely had their own legal vulnerabilities and feared that involving themselves in a high-profile investigation would invite scrutiny into their own illicit activities. For several years, this confession remained a secret, shared only in the smoky haze of a bar. It sat in the mind of the witness, perhaps gnawing at their conscience, or perhaps simply filed away as a piece of leverage. It was not until 2017, when the investigation ramped up again and appeals for information were renewed with promises of protection and rewards, that the witness finally broke their silence. When this information finally reached the investigators, it acted as the missing key. It allowed them to look backward at Christian B. with a fresh perspective. Suddenly, his presence in the Algarve, his history of burglaries, his camper van, and his Jaguar were not just isolated facts. They were pieces of a picture that the confession pulled together. The police realized they were not looking for a complex international network, but a singular, arrogant individual who had likely stayed under the radar due to the incompetence of the system and the silence of his peers. This incident forces us to evaluate the fragility of justice. If Christian B. had not been drinking that night, or if the news report had not played on the television, he might never have spoken. If he had remained silent, the connection might never have been made. It is a terrifying realization that the breakthrough in the most famous missing person case in modern history hinged not on forensic brilliance, but on the fragile ego of a suspect who could not resist the urge to brag. The confession also highlights the bystander effect within criminal networks. How many other people knew? Christian B. lived a transient life, interacting with many individuals in the underbelly of European society. It is highly probable that this was not the only time he hinted at his involvement. The delay in reporting suggests that for some, the life of a missing daughter was less important than the code of the street. It raises a profound ethical question about the responsibility of those who hear such secrets. The silence of the witness for those 4 years allowed Christian B. to remain free, potentially posing a risk to others. Ultimately, the confession in the bar serves as a testament to the fact that no crime is perfect. There is always a human element, a slip of the tongue, a moment of pride, a pang of guilt. Christian B. managed to evade forensic detection, but he could not evade his own psychology. His desire to be recognized as the one who knew became the very thing that led the authorities to his door. It stripped away his anonymity and placed him squarely in the center of the inquiry, transforming him from a ghost in the background into the primary focus of a global pursuit for truth. While the world remained fixated on the sun-drenched coast of Portugal, a pivotal development in the investigation was unfolding hundreds of miles away in the gray, industrial landscape of central Germany. It was here, amidst the rust and neglect, that investigators uncovered a digital graveyard, a collection of evidence that would provide a terrifying glimpse into the suspect's private world. In early 2016, German authorities executed a search warrant on this property, located in the village of Neuwegesleben. The site was not a functioning factory in the traditional sense. It was a sprawling, chaotic collection of debris, overgrown vegetation, and abandoned structures. It was a place that perfectly mirrored the transient and hidden life of Christian B. He had used this location as a residence and a storage facility, a place where he could exist without the prying eyes of neighbors or landlords. The search was comprehensive, utilizing cadaver dogs and specialized excavation teams. The investigators were not just looking for stolen goods. They were looking for biological traces or personal items that could link the suspect to his past crimes. What they found, however, was something far more enduring than physical DNA. Buried deep within the grounds, hidden in a way that suggested a deliberate attempt to preserve them for the future, were multiple digital storage devices, hard drives, and USB memory sticks. In the modern era of criminal investigation, the discovery of a digital hoard is often more damaging than a fingerprint. A fingerprint places a suspect at a location, but a hard drive places investigators inside the suspect's mind. When forensic technicians eventually bypassed the encryption and accessed the files, they found a staggering volume of data. The drives reportedly contained thousands of images and video files. These were not mundane family albums or pirated movies. They were collections of illegal material, focusing on the harmful acts against of young individuals. This discovery was a watershed moment. While it did not immediately produce a direct image of the missing daughter from the Ocean Club, it established something arguably just as critical for the prosecution: propensity. In the legal world, proving that a suspect has a propensity or a natural inclination toward a specific type of behavior is difficult. However, the sheer volume of the material found at the factory, numbering in the thousands of files, painted a portrait of an individual deeply obsessed with the control and mistreatment of vulnerable subjects. Criminal psychologists analyze such collections as trophies or souvenirs. Offenders who target vulnerable populations often feel a compulsive need to document their acts or collect material that validates their desires. The fact that these drives were buried, literally interred in the earth, suggests a complex psychological relationship with the evidence. Christian B. knew the material was radioactive. He knew that possession of it would lead to immediate incarceration, yet he could not bring himself to destroy it. He chose to hide it, keeping it accessible for a later date, much like a dragon guarding a hoard. This behavior indicates a high level of risk tolerance and a deep-seated addiction to the material. Among the digital files, investigators also made a physical discovery that sent shockwaves through the case. In the wreckage of the property, they found physical items of clothing, specifically swimwear and clothing belonging to young female individuals. These items did not belong to anyone known to be residing with Christian B. The presence of these garments raises disturbing questions. Were they stolen during his many burglaries of holiday apartments? Or were they kept as mementos from specific encounters? The connection between the factory discovery and the case in Portugal is indirect but powerful. It dismantled the defense that Christian B. was merely a drug dealer or a petty thief. It categorized him definitively as an offender with a specific interest in young subjects. When you combine this profile with his presence at the Ocean Club, the burglary gone wrong theory begins to lose weight, replaced by the more sinister theory of a targeted abduction. Critics of the investigation have asked why this evidence was not found sooner. The property had been in Christian B.'s possession for years. The delay highlights the fragmented nature of European law enforcement. While he was being investigated for drug offenses and burglaries in one district, the specialized teams handling missing persons cases in another country were unaware of his existence. The factory stood for years as a silent monument to his crimes, ignored until the dots were finally connected. The implications of the factory search extend beyond the courtroom. They provide a psychological profile of the suspect that is consistent with the worst fears of the public. A man who buries hard drives full of exploitative material is a man who plans, who hides, and who compartmentalizes his life. It suggests that if he did take the missing subject, he would have had the discipline and the foresight to dispose of the evidence with equal care. Furthermore, the recovery of this data allowed investigators to cross-reference the dates of the files with Christian B's movements. They could see where he was living when certain files were created or downloaded. This digital timeline helped to fill in the gaps of his years in the Algarve, proving that his interest in young individuals was not a fleeting phase, but a chronic and escalating fixation. The factory in New Egersleben stands as a grim symbol of the case. It represents the hidden depths of the suspect's criminality. It was a place where the facade of the hippie drifter fell away, revealing the calculated criminal underneath. The evidence found there may not have included a smoking gun in the form of a direct link to the Ocean Club, but it provided the ammunition needed to keep Christian B behind bars, ensuring that he could no longer roam the streets while the investigation into the vanishing continued. It proved that while he may have been a ghost in Portugal, in Germany, he was a hoarder of secrets, and the earth had finally given them up. The summer of 2020 was a period of global stillness, with much of the world paused due to international health restrictions. However, in the quiet corridors of the German justice system, a storm had been gathering strength for years, waiting for the precise moment to break. On June 3, 2020, that storm finally made landfall. In a sudden and unannounced press conference that caught the global media off guard, the prosecutor's office in Braunschweig, Germany, delivered a statement that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the investigation into the disappearance at the Ocean Club. For 13 years, the narrative had been dominated by sightings, sketches of unknown men, and endless speculation about the parents. But on this day, a senior German prosecutor, Hans Christian Wolters, stepped before the microphones and presented a new reality. He announced that his office was investigating a middle-aged German national, referred to only as Christian B, on suspicion of being responsible for the tragedy. This was not a vague lead or a request for information about a shadowy figure seen walking on a beach. This was a direct, targeted accusation against a specific individual with a known history. The prosecutor's tone was somber and definitive. He stated that the authorities assumed the young family member was no longer with us. This declaration sent a shockwave through the public consciousness. For over a decade, the Keep the Hope Alive campaign had been the emotional engine of the search. The German authorities were effectively extinguishing that flame, replacing the hope of a reunion with the cold reality of a criminal inquiry into a fatal act. What made this announcement particularly complex and controversial was the divergence in official narratives. While the German Federal Criminal Police Office, the BKA, classified the case as an inquiry into the taking of a life, the Metropolitan Police in the United Kingdom continued to treat it as a missing person investigation. This semantic difference was not merely bureaucratic. It reflected a profound gap in the evidence. The German investigators claimed to have concrete evidence that the life of the young subject had been ended. However, they admitted in the same breath that they did not have the physical remains. This paradox, claiming certainty of a tragic outcome without the recovery of the individual, sparked intense debate among legal analysts and criminal experts. How can a prosecutor be so sure of a fatality without a body? The answer, according to legal observers, likely lies in the nature of the strong evidence the prosecutor alluded to. It is widely speculated that this evidence is not forensic in the traditional sense, such as DNA found on a weapon, but rather admissions made by the suspect himself, perhaps captured in the digital correspondence found at the factory or in witness statements that have not yet been made public. Critics of the announcement argued that going public before charges were formally filed was a high-risk strategy in the chess game of criminal justice. Revealing your hand too early can allow a suspect to fortify their defense. However, investigators likely calculated that the benefits outweighed the risks. Christian B was already incarcerated for other offenses, meaning he was not a flight risk. By broadcasting his face and the details of his vehicles, the camper van and the Jaguar, the police were engaging in a tactic known as flushing the bush. They were hoping that by shaking the tree, Witnesses who had remained silent for 13 years would finally fall out. The appeal for information was specific and highly unusual. The police released the phone number involved in the 30-minute call on the night of the disappearance. They asked not just, "Did you see this man?" but "Did you call this number?" This level of granularity suggested that the police had solved 90% of the puzzle, but were missing the final piece that would secure a conviction in a court of law. They needed the person on the other end of that phone line to confirm the suspect's location and state of mind. The psychological impact of this announcement on the parents cannot be overstated. For years, they had fought against the theory that their young family member was gone. To hear a foreign authority state it as a fact, without providing them with the final proof, must have been a form of unique torture. The German prosecutor reportedly sent a letter to the parents, confirming their conclusions but stating that they could not share the specific evidence yet, as it would jeopardize the ongoing investigation. This decision was met with mixed reactions. Some saw it as a necessary procedural safeguard, while others viewed it as unnecessarily cruel to a family desperate for closure. From a journalistic perspective, the 2020 announcement shifted the genre of the story. It moved the case from a mystery to a procedural thriller. The question was no longer what happened, but can they prove it? The focus turned entirely to the suspect's past. Journalists began to descend on the villages in the Algarve where Christian B. had lived, interviewing former landlords, neighbors, and associates. A picture emerged of a man who was deeply embedded in the local landscape, yet entirely detached from its moral fabric. The announcement also highlighted the systemic failures of the European justice system. The fact that Christian B. had been a known offender living in the area, yet was never flagged during the initial investigation in 2007, raised serious questions about cross-border data sharing. How did a man with a record of offenses against young individuals slip through the net of the most expensive missing persons search in history? The revelation that he had been interviewed as a witness in unrelated cases but never scrutinized for this one suggested a compartmentalization of intelligence that benefited the offender and failed the victim. Furthermore, the timing of the announcement in 2020 was critical regarding the statute of limitations. In Portugal, the statute of limitations for serious crimes involving a life sentence is 15 years. The clock was ticking. By 2022, the ability to prosecute the crime in the country where it occurred would theoretically expire. The German authorities were racing against time, not just to find evidence, but to navigate the complex legal frameworks of two different nations. By naming him a suspect, they effectively paused certain legal clocks, buying themselves more time to build a case that was, by their own admission, dependent on circumstantial chains rather than a single smoking gun. It was the moment the shadows were dispelled by the harsh light of a criminal accusation. The announcement did not bring the young subject back, nor did it immediately put the suspect on trial, but it did something arguably just as important. It validated the theory that this was not an accident, nor a conspiracy by the family, but the act of a solitary, predatory figure. It reframed the narrative from one of unexplained loss to one of criminal accountability, setting the stage for a legal battle that would rely on the memories of witnesses and the digital ghosts of the past to finally deliver a verdict. To fully comprehend the events of May 3rd, 2007, one must move beyond the physical map of the Ocean Club and navigate the darker, more complex geography of the suspect's mind. While forensic science deals in fingerprints and DNA, criminal psychology deals in patterns, motivations, and the terrifying architecture of the antisocial personality. In the case of Christian B., investigators and psychologists have pieced together a profile that reveals a man driven not by complex master plans, but by a dangerous cocktail of impulsivity, narcissism, and a profound lack of empathy. The foundation of this profile is what clinical experts often refer to as a versatile criminal history. Christian B. was not a specialist. He did not stick to one type of violation. His record is a mosaic of theft, drug dealing, property damage, and interpersonal violence. This versatility is a hallmark of antisocial personality disorder. Individuals with this profile often view laws not as moral boundaries, but as arbitrary obstacles to their immediate gratification. They do not specialize because they do not care. They take what is available, whether it is a stereo from a parked car, a wallet from a hotel room, or, tragically, a vulnerable individual from a bed. A critical component of his psychology is his drifter lifestyle. For years, Christian B. lived in a camper van, moving between Germany and the southern coast of Portugal. To the casual observer, this might appear to be a life of bohemian freedom. However, from a profiling perspective, this constant movement is often a mechanism of avoidance. It allows the subject to detach from social norms and community oversight. By having no fixed address, he had no fixed accountability. This transience allowed him to reinvent his history with every border crossing, effectively resetting the clock on his reputation. It allowed a predator to live among tourists who saw him merely as a local eccentric rather than a threat. Narcissism also plays a pivotal role in the assessment of Christian B. The very act of keeping the digital trophies found at the factory suggests a person who feels entitled to possess and control others. But the most telling symptom of his narcissism was his inability to stay silent. The conversation in the bar, where he allegedly boasted about knowing the fate of the missing subject, is a classic example of criminal leakage. A disciplined offender would take such a secret to the grave. A narcissistic offender, however, struggles with the burden of anonymity. They want the credit. They want the world to know that they outsmarted the police, even if revealing that fact puts them in jeopardy. This psychological need to feel superior to the authorities became his Achilles heel. We must also analyze the concept of the hot prowl. Christian B. was a prolific burglar, specifically targeting occupied holiday apartments. Most burglars are risk-averse. They prefer empty houses. A burglar who enters a home while the occupants are sleeping falls into a different, more dangerous category. This behavior demonstrates a high tolerance for risk and a voyeuristic thrill derived from being close to potential victims. It suggests that the boundary between theft and violence is thin. Psychologists argue that for such an offender, the primary motivation is the invasion itself, the power of standing in a stranger's private sanctuary. If he entered the Ocean Club apartment to steal cash, and then encountered a sleeping subject, the psychological leap from thief to abductor was not a massive jump. It was a lateral step on a path he had been walking for years. Furthermore, the profile highlights a disturbing lack of empathy, often described as callousness. The attack on the 72-year-old woman in 2005 serves as the grim proof of this trait. To control and harm an elderly individual requires a complete shutdown of human connection. The offender must view the victim not as a person, but as an object, a means to an end. This process of dehumanization is what allows such individuals to commit heinous acts without the paralyzing weight of guilt. If he was capable of this in 2005, it stands to reason that his capacity for cruelty remained intact in 2007. However, it is crucial to correct a common misconception. The media often portrays figures like Christian B. as evil geniuses or masterminds. The profile suggests the opposite. He was disorganized, impulsive, and often reckless. He registered cars in his own name. He kept evidence in his own home, and he bragged to friends. The fact that he evaded capture for the disappearance for so long was not due to his brilliance, but rather due to the systemic failures of the investigation. He was not a ghost. He was simply ignored. The police were looking for a complex international trafficking ring, while the reality was likely a local, disorganized offender acting on a sudden impulse. Finally, we must consider the role of substance use. Witnesses and associates have described Christian B. as a heavy drinker and a user of illicit substances. Intoxication lowers inhibition and increases impulsivity. It acts as a catalyst for latent violent tendencies. A man who is already predisposed to antisocial behavior becomes exponentially more dangerous when his judgment is impaired by chemicals. The 30-minute phone call on the night of the incident might have been a transaction for substances or a conversation fueled by them. In summary, the profile of Christian B is not that of a sophisticated villain from a movie. It is the profile of a garden-variety criminal who was allowed to escalate because the system failed to intervene. He was a thief, a liar, and a manipulator who operated in the blind spots of society. Understanding this profile is essential because it demystifies the crime. It suggests that the tragedy was not an intricate conspiracy, but the brutal intersection of a vulnerable family and a man who had spent his entire adult life taking whatever he wanted, regardless of the cost to others. As we move toward a reconstruction of the events of that fateful night in May 2007, we must discard the idea of a grand, cinematic conspiracy. The reality of crime is often far more chaotic and banal. The prevailing theory held by German prosecutors regarding Christian B is not one of a meticulously planned extraction, but rather a theory of opportunity. This narrative suggests that the intersection of the offender and the young subject was a tragic accident of timing a burglary that spiraled into a fatal event. Investigators surmise that Christian B likely arrived at the Ocean Club with the primary intention of theft. This aligns with his established pattern of behavior. He knew that ground-floor apartments in holiday resorts were soft targets, often containing cash, cameras, and electronics, left behind by tourists enjoying their evenings. The theory suggests that he entered the apartment through the window or the unlocked patio door, expecting an empty room. It is at this precise moment that the timeline fractures. Upon entering, he did not find an empty room. He found 3 sleeping individuals. In the mind of an offender with his specific psychological profile, one marked by a lack of impulse control and a history of deviant interests, the objective shifted instantly. The theft of material goods became secondary to a darker, more immediate desire. This was not a calculated plan to take a specific person. It was a split-second decision made by an intruder who stumbled upon a vulnerable situation. The transfer theory is critical to understanding the lack of immediate evidence. If the intent changed from burglary to the taking of a person, the offender needed to move quickly. The layout of the Ocean Club, with its shadows and pathways, provided cover, but the risk of discovery was immense. The theory posits that the young family member was removed from the bed and taken directly to the nearby vehicle, likely the camper van or the Jaguar. This transfer would have taken only minutes. Once the individual was inside the vehicle, the crime scene effectively moved. The apartment was left relatively sterile because the primary act of violence or containment did not happen there. It happened in the mobile environment of the van. This explains why the dogs used in the initial search struggled to find a definitive scent trail leading away from the apartment. If the individual was carried and placed into a vehicle parked nearby, the scent trail would end at the curb. The vehicle then becomes the primary location of interest. This aligns with the strong evidence German police claim to possess likely biological traces or specific fibers found within the suspect's van that link him to the victim, even years later. The most harrowing aspect of this theory is the disposal. The question that has haunted the investigation is, where is the young subject now? The Algarve region of Portugal is a landscape of stark contrasts. While the coast is populated and bright, the interior is a vast, rugged terrain of scrubland, disused wells, and remote reservoirs. It is a landscape that can keep secrets for decades. Investigators believe that the offender, panic-stricken by the magnitude of what he had done and the global media storm that followed within 24 hours, sought to conceal the tragic loss immediately. The re-registration of the Jaguar the very next day supports the idea of a man desperate to distance himself from his means of transport. The theory suggests that the individual was taken to a remote location, a place known to the suspect from his years of drifting through the countryside, and left where she would not be found. The lack of a body is not proof of survival. In the eyes of the prosecution, it is proof of an effective disposal in a vast and unforgiving landscape. This opportunistic theory is terrifying because it highlights the fragility of safety. It implies that there was no specific target, no long-term surveillance, just a random alignment of a criminal and an unlocked door. It suggests that if the parents had returned 5 minutes earlier, or if the offender had chosen the apartment next door, history would be different. It strips the case of its mystery and leaves us with the raw, uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, the worst tragedies are caused by the simplest, most random acts of evil. If the timeline of the crime is a tragedy of opportunity, the timeline of the suspect's life is a tragedy of systemic failure. Christian B. did not appear out of a vacuum in 2007. He was a man with a heavy, documented history of criminal behavior. The question that demands an answer is, why was a man with his record allowed to live freely in a family resort town, unmonitored and unchecked? To understand this, we must look at the legal framework of Europe in the 2000s. The principle of freedom of movement allows citizens to travel and live anywhere within the European Union. While this is a triumph for liberty, it created a blind spot for law enforcement. When Christian B. moved from Germany to Portugal, his criminal record did not automatically trigger a red flag with the local Portuguese police. He was effectively able to leave his past at the border. The local authorities in Praia da Luz saw a German mechanic living in a van. They did not see a man with a history of offenses against young individuals and theft. This lack of cross-border communication is the first major systemic failure. There was no centralized database that alerted local precincts when a high-risk offender moved into their jurisdiction. Had the Portuguese police known who was living in that farmhouse, Christian B. would have been the first person visited on the morning of May 4th. Instead, he was invisible. The second failure lies in the leniency of the sentencing he received for his prior crimes. Christian B. had been in and out of the prison system since he was an adolescent. However, the sentences were often short, focused on the specific act rather than the danger the individual posed to society. He served time for theft and drug offenses, but the system failed to address the underlying pathology. He was released repeatedly without adequate rehabilitation or supervision. The justice system treated him as a nuisance, a petty criminal, rather than a danger in the making. We must also scrutinize the investigation into the 2005 attack on the 72-year-old woman. This was a brutal, major crime that occurred in the same area. Evidence was collected, but the case went cold. It took nearly 15 years to link Christian B. to that crime. Had that investigation been more rigorous, had the DNA been processed and matched sooner, Christian B. would have been in custody in 2007. He would have been in a prison cell, not parked near the Ocean Club. The failure to solve the earlier crime directly paved the way for the later tragedy. Furthermore, there is the issue of the statute of limitations. In many European countries, there is a time limit on how long prosecutors have to bring charges for certain crimes. This creates a perverse incentive for offenders to hide and wait. If they can stay silent long enough, the law can no longer touch them. Christian B. benefited from this legal ticking clock. He moved. He stayed quiet, and he relied on the bureaucracy to lose track of him. The missing individual was not just taken by a man. She was failed by the institutions designed to protect her. The walls that should have kept a threat away were full of holes. Holes created by poor data sharing, lenient sentencing, and a lack of resources for cold cases. The loopholes were not abstract legal concepts. They were the gaps through which a dangerous man slipped again and again until it was too late. As we reach the conclusion of this inquiry, we are left with a picture that is clearer, yet painfully incomplete. Christian B. sits in a German prison today, serving a sentence for the attack on the 72-year-old woman and drug offenses. The investigation into the disappearance at the Ocean Club is technically still active, but it has entered a new, strange phase, a legal standoff between certainty and proof. The German prosecutor remains steadfast. He has stated publicly that he believes the case is solved. He believes Christian B. is the man responsible for the taking, and the tragic end of the young subject. Yet, charges for this specific crime have not yet been formally laid. This delay speaks to the incredibly high burden of proof required in a murder trial. Without a body, and without a confession that can be used in court, the bar conversation is hearsay until the witness testifies under oath. The prosecutor is building a circumstantial castle. He needs every brick, the van, the phone records, the past crimes, the fibers to be perfectly aligned to ensure a conviction. He knows he only gets one shot at a trial. If Christian B. is acquitted, he can never be tried again for this crime. For the parents, this unending silence is a specific kind of torment. They are trapped in a state of ambiguous loss. They have been told by one police force that the missing individual is gone, and by another that there is still hope. They have lived for nearly 2 decades in the glare of the public eye, subjected to cruel theories and invasive scrutiny. The naming of Christian B. offered a target for their anger, but it has not yet offered them the peace of a funeral or the closure of a verdict. The legacy of this case extends far beyond the family. The disappearance changed the way the world views travel and parenting. It ended the era of the free-range holiday. The image of the young family member has become a global symbol of vulnerability. It serves as a permanent reminder that safety is an illusion that can be shattered in minutes. It has forced changes in how police handle missing person reports, leading to faster response times and better cross-border cooperation protocols, such as the Amber Alert system being more integrated across Europe. In the final analysis, the story of the shadow at the Ocean Club is a narrative about the limits of human justice. We may know who did it. We may know how he did it. We may even know why. But knowing is not the same as proving. Christian B. may spend the rest of his life in prison for other crimes, and perhaps that is a form of justice. But the ultimate truth, the location of the young individual, and the specific details of her final hours remains locked away, buried in the silence of a man who refuses to speak and a landscape that refuses to yield its secrets. We end not with a period, but with a question mark. The file remains open. The search continues, not for a living soul, but for the truth that will finally allow the story to end. Until then, the silence remains deafening, a void that no amount of speculation can fill.